He had never planned to linger in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The summer of 2003 pressed down like a heavy hand, the air rippling above cracked sidewalks and the asphalt melting beneath idle cars. His days were meant to be simple. Odd jobs, quick pay, nothing that left a trace. Then came the house at the edge of town, its paint chipped, its shutters stubbornly closed against the sun. Locals whispered about the woman who lived there, a widow who rarely spoke and never welcomed strangers inside. Her name was Evelyn, and she carried herself with the kind of stillness that suggested loss too heavy to name. The first time he saw her, something shifted. It wasn't her silver-streaked hair or the neat rows of books stacked behind her doorway. It was her eyes, steady and unreadable, watching him not as a boy with tools but as if he might undo the fragile order she had built. In that gaze he felt a warning and an invitation, as though he could either destroy her carefully guarded silence or be the one to keep it safe. He arrived on Maple Street just after noon, the heat pressing against his back as he carried the worn toolbox up the narrow walkway. The house looked lived in but strangely untouched, its white paint flaking at the edges, its windows sealed tight as though they had forgotten how to open. The yard was tidy, the hedges trimmed, the path swept, and yet the air around the place felt heavier than the quiet neighborhood deserved. When the door finally creaked open, Evelyn stood there with her silver-streaked hair pulled loosely away from her face, bare feet on the cool wooden floorboards. She looked neither surprised nor welcoming, her expression fixed in that space between politeness and dismissal. She gave him no warmth, only acknowledgement, and stepped aside without another word. Inside, the house seemed unnaturally still. There were no photographs on the walls, no signs of family captured in frames. Instead, books dominated the space, spilling from shelves, stacked and uneven. Towers on the stairs, scattered on counters and side tables. Their presence filled the silence more than voices ever could. A half-finished glass of red liquid rested on the staircase, catching a dull glint of light. The air carried no scent of meals or flowers, only the dry weight of paper and dust. It felt like a place waiting for someone who had never returned. He was meant to check the gutters and inspect the shingles, an hour at most, nothing more. Yet the longer he stood in that quiet space, the less it felt like a simple job. Something in her stillness held him there, some unspoken gravity that pressed against his chest and refused to let him move on as quickly as he intended. The following day the sky hung low with the heaviness of late summer, and he found himself back on Maple Street, tools in hand, telling himself it was only to double-check the gutters. The house looked the same, its shutters closed against the light, its porch swept clean but without welcome. When Evelyn opened the door, she neither smiled nor frowned, only turned and walked back inside, leaving the space for him to follow if he wished. On the kitchen table a single cup of tea had been set down, steam rising in thin threads. No invitation was spoken, no gesture explained, yet the cup stood waiting as though the choice had already been made for him. He sat without asking, fingers tracing the chipped rim, while she moved through the room with a careful slowness that seemed practiced. Her steps were deliberate, her hands precise, as though even the smallest action carried the weight of memory. He noticed again the absence of photographs, the silence of a house that once might have been filled but now only echoed with her restrained presence. The books were everywhere still, but they felt less like decoration and more like companions, each one a fragment of her voice left unspoken. He wanted to ask why she lived surrounded by stories that were not her own, why the air in every corner felt like waiting, but the words remained trapped behind his teeth. The silence between them was not empty but sharp, a tension that pressed harder than conversation ever could. As the day slipped toward evening, the clouds finally broke. Rain began to fall with sudden urgency, tapping against the windows, drumming on the roof he had come to repair. When he glanced outside, the street shone with water, and in that flickering light he caught the glow of her window against the storm. He realized he was standing at her door again, rain soaking through his shirt, before he even remembered choosing to walk there. The storm had drenched him by the time she opened the door, the rain running in rivulets down his arms and dripping from his hair onto the wooden porch. She did not speak, only stepped aside with a quiet gesture, allowing him into the stillness of the house. A folded towel appeared in her hands, pressed toward him without meeting his eyes, her gaze fixed instead on some point just beyond his shoulder. He dried himself awkwardly, the sound of the fabric against his skin loud in the silence, while she moved through the room with a tense precision, as though afraid to disturb the air around them. The lamplight cast her profile into fragile lines, and he noticed the faint tremor in her hands when she set another cup down on the table. For a moment it seemed as if the storm outside had carried itself into the house, not with water but with pressure, heavy and charged. Then her voice broke the silence, low and unsteady, saying that people had begun to ask questions, wondering if she was his mother. The words hung between them, sharp and unyielding, testing the space they occupied. He forced a laugh that came too quickly, a sound brittle enough to fracture the tension, but her expression did not shift. Her eyes carried no amusement, only the faint outline of fear, as though she had already imagined how far such whispers could reach. Before he could find words to steady the moment, a sudden knock rattled through the wooden frame of the door. It was firm, deliberate, echoing against the quiet like a warning. She froze in place, her body taut, her breath caught in her throat. The color drained from her face as she turned toward the hallway, staring at the door with an intensity that made the room feel colder. When she finally spoke again, her voice was so faint it seemed meant only for herself, confessing that he was never supposed to find her here. The words sank into the silence, heavier than the storm, and left the air quivering with an unseen presence waiting just beyond the threshold. Through his uncle, he learned what the silence in her house had never spoken aloud. Evelyn had once been a professor at the university, brilliant and admired, the kind of woman who carried entire rooms with her voice. But that was before tragedy hollowed her world. Her only son had died in his 20s, a motorcycle accident that shattered the fragile balance of her life. Since then there had been no photographs on the walls, no reminders of family, only shelves of books stacked like barriers against memory. The knowledge stayed with him, coloring every glance, every pause she allowed to linger between them. Days later he saw her again by chance, in the dim light of a small grocery on the corner of Archer and Greenwood. She stood by the produce section, her hand hovering over the smooth skins of pomegranates as though uncertain whether to choose one or leave them all behind. The sight of her outside the boundaries of her house unsettled him, as though he had stumbled across a secret she had not meant to share. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her expression calm but distant, eyes fixed not on the fruit but somewhere far beyond. He felt the weight of what he now knew pressing against him, the invisible presence of a son whose absence shaped every room she walked into. When she noticed him, her gaze lifted and held his without flinching. For the first time, the silence between them softened, though her face betrayed nothing but composure. He made a small remark about the glass he had once seen by her staircase, assuming it was wine, and in that moment her lips curved into something fragile, almost a smile. She corrected him, her words plain and unembellished, explaining it was not wine at all but cranberry juice for her blood pressure. The simplicity of it struck him, peeling back another layer of mystery he had built around her. His own smile rose unguarded, and for a fleeting second she mirrored it, her face transformed by an expression he had never seen before. Yet even in that rare glimpse of warmth, her eyes betrayed a searching quality, as though they were still fixed on a figure just out of reach, someone who belonged to her past and would never return. It was there, in the shadow behind her gaze, that he understood how deep her losses had carved into her, how every moment of softness came tempered with absence. Standing among the fruit and the faint hum of refrigerators, he realized he was not only looking at her but also at the echo of someone she could not let go. It happened on an evening thick with the restless energy of a town gathering, the kind of event filled with folding chairs, paper lanterns, and the low hum of voices carrying across the field. He had come only to deliver supplies, nothing more, moving quietly between tables when the sound of her laughter reached him. It was a sound he had never heard from her before, open, unrestrained, carried on the air like something long forgotten. He turned and saw her standing beside a man, her hand resting lightly on his arm as though it had always belonged there. The man was older, his posture familiar, his presence confident. The name surfaced quickly, Paul. He understood without being told that this was someone who had once mattered, someone whose shadow had never truly left her life. He froze among the rows of empty chairs, his chest tightening as he watched her lean closer to listen to words that were not his. For a long moment he could not move, anchored by the strange mix of envy and disbelief pressing against his ribs. She looked different with him, lighter somehow, her smile unguarded in a way he had never been able to unlock. and then her eyes found him across the distance. The smile collapsed almost instantly, as if it had been something fragile, too easily broken under the weight of recognition. She excused herself quickly and crossed the space between them, but the warmth she carried only moments before had already drained away. Her voice came rushed, defensive, insisting that what he had seen was not what he thought. The words rang hollow, stripped of conviction, and the ache in his chest deepened. He asked the question that had haunted him for weeks, the one he had never dared to shape aloud until that instant. What were they? The answer cut swiftly, sharper than he expected. There was no us, she said, her tone final, her body rigid. He was too young, she was too old, and everything between them had been nothing more than a reflection of a ghost she could not release. He reminded her of someone, but he was not him. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, the air thinner, each breath harder to take. Anger and grief collided inside him, demanding to be shouted, to be released, but all that left his lips was a single question, softer and far more dangerous. If there was truly nothing between them, then why did she never push him away? Why had she allowed him into her silences, into her house, into the fragments of her life she guarded so closely? The silence that followed was louder than any storm. Her eyes flickered with something unspoken, something close to panic, and then she turned. Without explanation, without another word, she pulled away and walked quickly into the night, leaving him standing among the rows of chairs, the echo of her retreat hollowing the space between them. 3 days passed in silence, the kind of silence that stretched until it felt permanent. He spent his hours at the community garden, the earth cool beneath his hands, the steady rhythm of work dulling the unrest that refused to leave him. It was late afternoon when he looked up and saw her. She stood framed in the doorway, the thin fabric of her coat tugged by the restless wind, her hair falling across her face in strands she made no attempt to brush away. For a long moment she did not move, and neither did he, as though the space between them had grown too wide to cross. When she finally stepped forward, her expression carried both fragility and resolve. Her hands trembled at her sides, and though her voice was steady, it carried a weight that revealed its struggle. She admitted that she had sent him away not out of disdain, but out of fear, the fear of breaking again what little she had managed to preserve, the fear of destroying something she had no right to touch. Each word seemed torn from a place deeper than regret, from a wound that had never healed. She came closer, and he saw the raw truth in her eyes, unguarded for once, stripped of silence. She confessed what frightened her most. The thought of being loved not for memories, not for promises, not for what she had once been, but for who she was now in this fragile moment of her life. To be seen in the present without the shelter of the past was the most terrifying thing of all. He did not answer with explanations or arguments. He simply reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold, uncertain, but she did not pull away. He held them firmly, not as a promise but as an anchor. He told her without words that fear was allowed, that lies were not, that what they had did not need to carry eternity to matter. They found a bench behind the center, away from the noise of the street, and sat together as the wind stirred the branches overhead. Her hand remained in his, the silence between them no longer sharp but steady, filled with the quiet rhythm of choice. There were no vows, no declarations of forever. There was only the present, a fragile decision to remain side by side, and in its simplicity it felt more real than anything either of them had spoken before.